Have you ever felt like you are the one who always sacrifices, always endures, yet also the one most overlooked in your own home? The story of Sophia Johnson will make you reflect on yourself, on family, on justice, and on the true worth of a person who dares to stand up and reclaim her life. The winter air in the small Oregon town bit softly at the skin, never fully harsh, but persistent enough to be felt. In a modest two-story house with faded blue paint and wind chimes that clinked gently in the breeze, lived Sophia Johnson, a woman in her mid-30s whose presence was often quieter than the ticking of the kitchen clock. Her neighbors would describe her as polite, dependable, always ready with a kind word or a warm casserole. Most of them assumed she lived a peaceful, ordinary life, perhaps even enviable, surrounded by family, rooted in the home where she had grown up. But inside that house, beneath the hum of the refrigerator and the creaking of the wooden floorboards, lived something far more complex than the image she presented. Sophia was thoughtful to a fault, endlessly compassionate, and careful not to speak too much, lest she upset the delicate balance of the people around her. She was the type of woman who remembered everyone's birthday, who refilled the soap dispenser without being asked, who apologized even when others were in the wrong. And yet, that same gentleness often became a curse, because in a family like hers, silence was not just golden, it was expected. She shared the house with her adoptive parents, Margaret and Henry, and her 3 male cousins, James, Michael, and Thomas. Though she called them cousins, they had grown up more like brothers. The house had once belonged to Margaret's parents, and after their passing, it had become the hub for the extended Johnson family. To outsiders, they appeared united, church-going, always hosting holiday dinners, smiling in photographs that adorned the living room shelves. But Sophia knew better. Love in that house was a conditional currency, dispensed sparingly and rarely in her direction. Her days began before dawn, often with the quiet ritual of making coffee in the stillness of the kitchen. She would check the mail, start a load of laundry, prepare breakfast, and make sure Henry's medications were sorted for the day. Her movements were instinctive, a choreography learned through years of invisible labor. The others would stumble in around 7 a.m., bleary-eyed and half-dressed, grumbling about work or money or the news. No one thanked her for the eggs or the folded laundry. No one asked how she had slept. Once, while she was pouring coffee into her father's mug, he muttered without looking up from his newspaper, "You should be grateful you have a home. Some people your age are still living out of motels." Sophia smiled faintly and nodded. That was her role, the agreeable one, the responsible one, the one who never made demands. She worked 2 part-time jobs, at the town's library and at a nearby elder care center. But somehow, her income often disappeared into the family budget. New tires for Michael's truck, groceries for the house, repairs for the dishwasher that no one else ever seemed to notice was broken. Her own needs were always postponed. She wore the same pair of winter boots for 7 years, patching a tear near the heel with clear tape. Sometimes she would sit in her car before heading inside, gripping the steering wheel tightly as the engine ticked in the cold. There, in those brief moments of solitude, she would allow herself the fantasy of a different life, one where she lived alone in a quiet apartment filled with sunlight and books, where no one raised their voice at the dinner table, where she was more than just a fixture in someone else's routine. But then she would take a breath, tuck the thought away like a forbidden letter, and return to the role assigned to her. Sophia Johnson, the good daughter, the reliable cousin, the woman no one ever really saw. On Tuesday evenings, Sophia usually arrived home just before dusk. The town's main street, lined with maple trees and antique shops that never quite stayed open long, was quiet as ever. After her shift at the library, where she spent hours helping elderly patrons reset passwords they could never remember, she would drive straight to the pharmacy to pick up Henry's prescriptions, then to the grocery store, where she had memorized every coupon policy and sale item. The trunk of her old sedan, which rattled slightly when turning left, always carried more than she bought for herself. That evening was no different. As she carried 2 paper bags into the house, one arm straining under the weight of milk, potatoes, and aspirin. No one came to open the door. She set them down on the porch to fish out her keys, hands red from the cold. Inside, the television was on, football echoing loudly from the living room where James and Michael were sprawled across the sofa, legs on the coffee table, an untouched pizza box between them. Neither looked up when she walked in. No one asked where she had been. The groceries were unpacked in silence. She moved around them like a ghost, refilling the fridge, tossing expired leftovers, and wiping down the counters out of habit. Afterward, she climbed the stairs to check on Margaret, who had been in bed all week with a sore back. In her mother's room, she adjusted the curtains and placed a heating pad over the worn comforter. "You missed dinner," Margaret said, not unkindly, but with a tone that suggested Sophia had erred. "I worked late," Sophia replied. "I left some soup downstairs if you want it later." There was no response. Margaret's eyes had already drifted back to the silent television in the corner, where a news anchor's lips moved without sound. Later, as she folded laundry in the small room that used to be the attic, Sophia paused over a neatly ironed shirt that belonged to Thomas. She had washed and pressed it that morning before her shift, though he had not asked her to. He never asked. None of them did, but they expected in the quiet way people expect the lights to turn on when they flip the switch. She stared at the fabric, the collar slightly frayed, and felt a sudden wave of exhaustion. Not the physical kind, but something deeper. A bone-deep weariness that came from being needed, but never acknowledged. There had been a time, nearly 15 years earlier, when her life could have taken another path. She remembered the letter, cream-colored and stamped with the university's seal, a full scholarship, a chance to study literature out of state. When she had shown it to Margaret, her mother had paused only a moment before folding it neatly and setting it on the kitchen counter. "Your father just had surgery, Sophia, and your cousins are barely out of high school. You can reapply next year." She never did. At the time, it had not even felt like a decision, just one more thing folded away, like the blouse she wore only for interviews, or the half-finished poems she used to write at night when the house was quiet. She told herself it was fine. That family came first. That sacrifice was a kind of love. But the years stretched. One next year became the next decade. The scholarship expired, and so did the version of Sophia, who once dreamed of lectures and libraries filled with sunlight. And still, she folded shirts and reheated dinners and paid bills that were not hers. No one ever said thank you, not in so many words. Appreciation in that house was not spoken, it was assumed, buried beneath the weight of expectation. The night deepened around the house like a thick, soundless fog. Downstairs, the last light from the living room flickered off, the television finally silenced. Upstairs, Sophia lay on her back in bed, eyes open in the dark, the soft hum of the radiator the only sound keeping her company. The familiar weight pressed down on her chest again, not pain exactly, but something dull and persistent, like being slowly buried under something you once chose to carry. She turned onto her side and stared at the window, where condensation clung to the glass. Somewhere beyond it, the wind moved gently through the trees, unnoticed by the sleeping town. But Sophia could not sleep, not easily, not anymore. Lately, her thoughts had begun to take on a sharper edge, their outlines no longer softened by resignation. She would catch herself in the middle of scrubbing a pan or changing the sheets in Margaret's room and suddenly think, "Why is it always me?" And then just as quickly, another voice inside her would whisper, "Do not be ungrateful." That voice, quiet but relentless, had lived in her head since she was a girl. It wore her mother's tone, smooth and condescending, reminding her that obligation was virtue and resentment was sin. Still, the cracks had begun to widen. She noticed them in how long she lingered in her car after work, in the way her hands sometimes trembled with unspent anger while she folded napkins, in the silence she held too tightly when someone raised their voice at the dinner table. There were days when she looked at her reflection and did not recognize the woman staring back, the fine lines around her mouth, the tired hollowness in her eyes, the gentle mouth that had forgotten how to say no. Once, only a few weeks before, she had tried something small, insignificant, really. She asked for a Saturday off from the elder care center and took a drive to the coast, something she had not done in years. The ocean had been a flat silver under the overcast sky, and she had sat on a bench with a cup of coffee doing nothing but breathing. For 3 hours she had not answered her phone. When she returned home, Margaret was waiting in the kitchen, arms crossed. "Must be nice," her mother said without looking at her, "to disappear whenever you feel like it. Some of us do not have that luxury." James had muttered something from the living room about the dishwasher still being broken. Thomas had asked what she brought back, as if a souvenir was the only justification for her absence. She had smiled through clenched teeth, apologized for not checking in, and made dinner for 6 people. By the time she went to bed that night, she hated herself for thinking she had deserved a day of quiet. Even now, curled beneath the weight of her blankets, the memory made her cheeks burn with a bitter mixture of shame and fury. She knew she was not blameless. After all, she had let this become her life. She had nodded, smiled, made excuses for everyone else's indifference. But there were moments, fragile and terrifying, when the truth rose up inside her like a scream pressed against glass. "I do not want this." And immediately that second voice returned, cold and precise. Then who would take care of them? Who would love them if you stopped? She pressed her eyes shut, hard enough to see sparks behind her lids. Somewhere in the stillness of her room, she began to wonder, what if love was not supposed to mean erasure? But no answer came. Only the radiator's steady hum and the quiet, aching knowledge that she was starting to change, even if she did not yet know how. The days slipped forward with the quiet monotony Sophia had grown used to. She moved through them like mist through trees, present but untouchable, necessary but unnoticed. Winter began to loosen its grip, and the town slowly thawed into the pale, reluctant light of early spring. The snowmelt left the sidewalks slick, and the backyard turned to mud, but daffodils began poking through the soil near the fence. Life went on. Sophia had come home early that Wednesday. Her shift at the library ended before noon due to a water main break, and instead of running errands or going straight to the elder care center, she had chosen to walk home. There was something about the air that day, brisk but full of promise, that made her want to move slowly, to feel the ground under her feet. Her legs ached slightly from the slope leading to their street, and her hands were numb with cold when she finally reached the house. The front door was unlocked. She stepped inside and paused, hearing voices drifting from the kitchen. At first, she meant to announce herself, but something about the tone, sharp, clipped, stopped her. Her name was mentioned. "She will not ask questions," James was saying. "She never does. We get it on the market before the roof needs another patch." "She has no claim anyway," Margaret replied, her voice flat and firm. "She is not really family. We just did what we had to." Sophia did not move. For a moment, she could not even breathe. Thomas spoke next, sounding uneasy. "She has been paying for the place longer than any of us. You do not think that will come back to bite us?" "She pays because she wants to be useful," Margaret snapped. "She was taken in out of kindness, not because we owed her anything. Your aunt made a mess of her life, and I cleaned it up. End of story." Silence followed. Chairs shifted. A glass was set down. Sophia backed away without making a sound, her heartbeat rushing in her ears like surf breaking against rocks. She slipped out the front door and walked without thinking. No coat, no purse, no destination. Just her feet carrying her away from the words that had detonated inside her chest. She had always known she was different in some nameless, shapeless way. She did not resemble anyone in the house. Her eyes were darker, her voice softer, her instincts more cautious. But she had never asked. She had never questioned the gaps in old photo albums or the vague, halting stories about her early childhood. She had not wanted to disturb the fragile narrative they had built. "You are one of us. You belong here." Now, that illusion had collapsed in the space of a few sentences. She wandered to the edge of the park near the town's edge and sat on a bench facing the empty playground. Her breath made clouds in the cold air. Her hands trembled. "Not really family," the words kept repeating. Not as an accusation, not even as cruelty. They had been spoken casually like a long-established fact. She was not their daughter. She was her aunt's child. Her mother, her real mother, was someone else entirely, someone who had vanished from the story before Sophia had ever understood she was in one. She remembered flashes of an earlier life now, strange and disjointed. A woman with a laugh like wind chimes, the scent of citrus, hands brushing her hair back at night, and then silence, absence, a new house, new rules, new names. Sophia sat on that bench until the sun dipped low and her skin burned with cold. No one called to ask where she was. No one noticed she had gone. It was not just betrayal she felt. It was the loss of everything she had used to anchor her life. The idea that love was earned, that if she did enough, gave enough, became small enough, they would one day truly see her. But now she understood. Her sacrifices were never seen as love, only as repayment for a debt she had never agreed to carry. That night, Sophia did not sleep. The ceiling above her bed became a blank sky that offered no peace, only reflection, cruel, relentless reflection. Her thoughts looped endlessly, tangled between disbelief and something colder, more corrosive, understanding. Not sudden, not explosive, but slow and creeping, like ice crawling across glass. She stared into the dark and saw nothing she recognized. She rose before dawn, her body hollowed by exhaustion. Her eyes were rimmed with red, her skin sallow. The kettle boiled and clicked off. She never poured the water. The house around her moved as it always had, creaking floors, footsteps overhead, the clatter of dishes, but it felt distant, like listening to her life through a wall. For the next several days, she moved through time like a ghost. Her appetite vanished. Meals she prepared for the others, still by habit, remained untouched on her own plate. The sound of her name, when someone called it, struck her ears as if it belonged to someone else. She showed up at work but forgot appointments, lost track of books, stared too long at computer screens with blank eyes. More than once, a coworker gently touched her arm and asked, "Are you all right?" And she smiled. Always smiled, the practiced automatic gesture that said, "I'm fine, really," even when everything inside her was unraveling. Eventually, she gathered the courage to ask Margaret. It was a quiet afternoon. The sun was thin and pale across the living room carpet. Her mother was folding towels, moving slowly, her back stiff as always. Sophia stood by the doorway, her fingers pressed against the molding. "Is it true?" she asked. Her voice sounded distant to her own ears. Margaret did not look up. "Is what true?" "That I'm not your daughter, that I was taken in." Margaret folded another towel with slow precision. "You always were dramatic, Sophia." "I heard you," Sophia said. Her voice cracked, but she held it steady. "I heard what you said to James and Thomas." Now Margaret looked at her, not startled, not guilty, just tired. "You should be grateful you had a roof over your head," she said, as if it were the end of the discussion. "Your mother, my sister, was not fit to raise you. We did what we had to." Sophia stepped back as if struck. The words did not bruise, they burned. Her mother, the woman she had loved, protected, cared for through fevers and cold nights, through falls and hip surgeries and bad birthdays, had not denied the truth. She had only reminded Sophia to be thankful, as if love was a favor, as if a life was a debt. In the days that followed, Sophia found herself questioning everything: her childhood memories, her relationships, the very shape of her identity. Who was she, if not the daughter she had spent her life trying to be? What part of her was real, and what had she built only to survive? She stared at old photographs differently now, searching faces, scanning eyes, measuring the distance between smiles. She thought of the way Henry had never called her sweetheart, the way Margaret always referred to her as the responsible one, but never my girl. She realized there was no baby album for her, no birthday stories before the age of 5, no heirlooms passed down. Everything she had once called home now felt like borrowed furniture. And with that realization came a new, quieter kind of grief. Not just for the lies, but for the years she had spent trying to earn a place that had never been truly offered. For the tenderness she had given without reserve. For the way she had folded herself smaller, quieter, easier, hoping that one day someone would say, "We see you. You belong." No one ever had, and now she was beginning to wonder if she ever truly would. The day Sophia moved out, the sky was a dull, unbroken gray, the kind that made even the morning feel tired. There were no goodbyes, no offers of help, not even a glance as she carried the last of her boxes to the car. Margaret stood at the kitchen sink, drying a cup with slow, deliberate movements, pretending not to see. The air in the house was thick with silence, as if even the walls had made their decision. Her apartment was on the second floor of a converted Victorian house, near the edge of town. The rooms were small and slanted oddly, as if the building had been bent under years of use, but it had a window that looked out onto a row of cottonwood trees and a radiator that hissed like a tired old cat. When she unlocked the door for the first time, her hands shook, not from excitement, but from a fear so quiet and absolute she could hardly breathe through it. The first night she lay on a borrowed mattress on the floor, surrounded by boxes she did not have the strength to open. The apartment was cold and unfamiliar. The absence of voices, of slammed doors and television static pressed in around her like a strange kind of grief. She had spent so long being needed that she did not know what to do with herself when no one was watching. There were no meals to prepare, no prescriptions to sort, no footsteps outside her door to listen for, just silence, honest, empty, terrifying silence. During the day, she filled her time with job applications. She revised her resume, walked to the library to print out copies, and circled postings in the local paper. But her experience was scattered. 2 part-time jobs and years of helping at home did not translate neatly into any title. More than once, interviewers glanced at her address, or the long stretch of time with no official position, and smiled politely before telling her, "We'll let you know." They never did. Money grew tight. She skipped dinners, watered down milk, used candles instead of turning on lights. She sold her car when the repairs became too costly and walked everywhere, even in the rain. Each step felt like pushing against a tide that never stopped coming. Sometimes in the quiet hours just before dawn, she would think about going back, just for a while, just until she got back on her feet. She imagined Margaret opening the door, arms crossed, ready with that familiar line. It did not work out, did it? The shame of that image clung to her like wet fabric. She would close her eyes and whisper into the dark, "You left for a reason. You left to live." That truth, fragile but luminous, kept her from turning around. It reminded her that freedom was not comfort. It was not immediate joy. It was a slow becoming, a painful shedding. Some nights she cried without knowing exactly why. Other nights she stood by the window and watched the trees sway, listening to the wind speak to her in a language she was just beginning to understand. She did not know what came next, but for the first time in her life, she was choosing something, not because it was expected, not because it was demanded, but because it was hers, her choice, her pain, her beginning. Spring edged into summer quietly, the days lengthening like slow exhalations. The trees outside Sophia's apartment grew full and green, and light spilled into her windows in soft golden sheets. She'd begun to sleep more deeply, though still not easily, and her mornings no longer felt like battles against some unseen weight. The silence, once unbearable, had shifted into something gentler, an open space rather than a void. It was during one of her walks to the community center, drawn more by a flyer on the bulletin board than real intention, that she found herself sitting awkwardly in a folding chair, surrounded by a circle of strangers. The room smelled faintly of coffee and industrial carpet, and the sign on the door read, Emotional Resilience Group, every Thursday at 6. She nearly left twice before the meeting began. But then a woman across the circle spoke, her voice steady but low. "My mother used to tell me I was born to ruin her life," she said, not as an accusation, but as a simple fact. "I believed her for a long time, still do some days." Sophia felt something unravel in her chest, a recognition, a release. She stayed. That woman's name was Eleanor. They did not speak much at first, just nodded politely, exchanged small smiles. Eleanor was a decade older, with streaks of silver through her dark hair and a quiet authority that came not from certainty, but from surviving doubt. She'd been a nurse once, before burnout and betrayal had hollowed her life. Her story was not the same as Sophia's, but it echoed in familiar chords. One Thursday, Eleanor waited by the door as the group disbanded. "There's a diner down the block," she said. "Coffee's terrible, pie's worse. You want to come?" They sat in a booth by the window, their cups steaming between them, and talked until the waitress stopped refilling. Not just about pain, but about absurd things too. Library books, badly behaved cats, the quiet ache of wanting to be seen. It was the first time in months Sophia laughed out loud without apology. Over time, their meetings became routine. They shared walks and silence and stories. Eleanor never pried, never pitied. She offered something far rarer, presence, without expectation. "I used to think healing was a mountain," Eleanor said once, as they sat by the riverbank watching dusk spread like ink. "You climb it, reach the top, and you're free. But I think it's more like gardening. Messy, slow, repetitive. Sometimes it grows wild, sometimes nothing blooms. But you keep tending it." Sophia let the words settle. They stayed with her long after, especially on the harder days. With Eleanor's quiet encouragement, she signed up for evening classes at the local community college, library management, cataloging systems, community programming. The coursework was dense, and she often studied late into the night, her fingers ink-smudged, her mind buzzing with the thrill of learning again. The old version of herself, the girl who once dreamed of books and open futures, rose slowly from the dust. She began to feel different in her own skin. Not lighter, exactly, but more rooted, more honest. She still had days where doubt crept in, where she questioned her right to want more, to ask for space, to carry her own name without apology. But those days came less frequently, and when they did, she had words now. Her own, and borrowed ones from women like Eleanor who had walked through fire and chose not to become ash. Sophia was still healing, still rebuilding. But for the first time, her life felt like something she was living, not merely enduring. And that, she realized, was its own kind of miracle. One afternoon in late October, while sorting through an old folder of bills and receipts for her budgeting class, Sophia stumbled upon a thick envelope of paperwork she had nearly forgotten. Bank statements, utility payments, home repair invoices. Most were in her name, dating back years. They had been filed away during the years she still thought of herself as part of something, that quiet, invisible engine keeping the household running. She sat for a long time with those papers spread across the small dining table in her apartment. The weight of them was not just in the ink and numbers, but in what they represented. Years of labor no one had acknowledged, sacrifices made without question. But what drew her focus, sharp and sudden, was a message she had overlooked in her inbox, a group email from James sent 3 days earlier. They were putting the house on the market. The deal was nearly done. No mention of her, not a single word. The betrayal hit different this time. It did not paralyze her. It clarified something. She called a lawyer the next morning. At first, she moved carefully, uncertain if she even had the right to ask. But the moment she sat down in that small law office, walls lined with dusty legal books, the window overlooking the courthouse lawn, she began to speak with a steadiness she did not expect. She brought everything. Documents, receipts, even her pay stubs. Her voice trembled only once when she said, "I gave them my entire 20s and most of my 30s. I never asked for anything back. But this is erasure." Her attorney, a woman named Lydia with sharp eyes and a calm voice, nodded without interrupting. "You are not invisible," she said quietly, "and we can make that known." The process unfolded slowly. Letters were sent. Calls were made. The Johnson household responded with disbelief, then condescension, and finally hostility. Margaret called once, just once, her voice brittle with indignation. "How dare you do this to us, after everything we gave you?" Sophia stood by her window, looking out at the cottonwoods now stripped bare for winter. "You did not give me a home," she said. "You gave me a place to work." There was no reply, only a dial tone. The pushback was brutal. James accused her of fabricating numbers. Michael, furious, called her selfish and delusional. Even Thomas, who had once seemed the gentlest, sent a curt message saying he didn't want to pick sides. They tried to discredit her, to paint her as unstable, a bitter woman with no gratitude. But Sophia did not bend. Every time doubt crept in, she returned to the quiet space she had built for herself, the hard-earned peace of her apartment, the worn pages of her coursework, the warmth of Eleanor's voice telling her that healing was not a straight line. She had learned not to flinch when someone raised their voice. She had learned to say no and mean it. In mediation, she sat across from them, her former family now tight-lipped and cold, and laid everything out with unwavering calm. Her attorney spoke for most of it, but when it came time for her to speak, Sophia met their eyes, one by one. "I was never asking to be repaid for love," she said, "but I will not be erased. Not again." The settlement was modest, enough to recognize her share, enough to begin again with firmer ground beneath her feet. It was not about the money, it never had been. It was about the right to exist, to matter, to be heard, and for the first time they heard her. After the mediation, the air between them thinned into something brittle, transparent, sharp, and easy to break. The family, once a tangled knot of dependency and silence, began to unravel in slow, uneven threads. They had always operated under a quiet, unwritten agreement that Sophia would endure, that she would never ask for more than they chose to give. Now that she had broken that rule, nothing felt solid. Margaret sent no follow-up call, no note, no apology. When news of the settlement circled back to her, she dismissed it publicly, at church, at the grocery store, as a legal formality, something Sophia had been manipulated into pursuing by strangers who did not understand family. In her version of the story, she had taken in a child when no one else would, raised her out of duty, not affection, and this betrayal, was how she had been repaid. "She was always too sensitive," Margaret told a neighbor once, her voice carrying through the window on a quiet afternoon. "She let her feelings get the better of her. That's not strength, that's selfishness." Sophia heard about it from someone else, of course. She had stopped attending church by then, stopped walking down the familiar streets of the neighborhood where everyone knew her name but never truly saw her. But Thomas came. It was nearly a month after everything had settled. She was sitting at the little desk near her window, sorting through class readings when there was a knock at the door. Not urgent, not rehearsed, just steady. When she opened it, Thomas stood there with his hands in his coat pockets, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "I don't want to take up your time," he said, then paused, the silence hanging between them like breath on glass. "But I wanted to say I was wrong about a lot of things." She said nothing at first, her hand still on the doorknob. He looked thinner, or maybe just smaller, without the noise of the others around him. "I knew it was unfair," he went on. "I knew how much you did for all of us. He trailed off, eyes lowering. "It was easier not to see it. You were always there, always fine. I thought if you stayed quiet, it meant it was okay." Sophia stepped aside, just far enough to let him in if he chose. He did not. Instead, he nodded once, eyes glassy with something she did not name, and stepped back into the cold. But as he turned, he added, almost like a confession, "I hope you're doing better now. You deserve better. The door closed gently behind him, not as a rejection, but as a boundary. James never called. Neither did Michael. From what Sophia gathered through mutual acquaintances, James had taken over most of the house sale logistics, treating it like a business transaction. Michael, ever more reactive, had gone quieter, angrier. At one point, she heard he had said to someone at work, "Sophia always thought she was better than the rest of us. Guess now she's proved it." But she no longer flinched when she heard things like that. She no longer wondered if it was her fault. The fracture between them had long existed. She had just been the first to name it, to stop pretending the cracks were character and not damage. And with that naming came release. The family, as she had known it, no longer existed. But in the space where that old structure once stood, heavy with resentment and silence, there was now room for something else. Not reconciliation, not yet, but truth. And Sophia had learned that truth, while often lonely, was always lighter to carry than a lie. Winter returned quietly that year, without the fanfare of storms or frost-bitten windows. The cold came like a whisper rather than a warning, and Sophia found herself noticing things she once moved past. How the lights softened over rooftops in late afternoon, how silence in her apartment had shifted from vacancy into calm. The anger, when it came now, did not arrive in waves. It flickered, small and sharp, before fading. There were mornings when she would stir milk into her coffee and think of Margaret's voice, that familiar edge of righteousness, and feel her jaw tighten. But the weight of resentment no longer anchored her. She had stopped feeding it. Forgiveness, she realized, was not absolution. It was not an act of rewriting the story or pretending the harm never happened. It was simply the act of loosening her grip, of releasing herself from the exhausting burden of carrying what they refused to acknowledge. She began with grief. Quiet, private, unhurried, she allowed herself to mourn not just the people, but the hopes she had once tied to them, the belief that if she worked hard enough, gave enough, proved herself enough, they would choose her, not out of obligation, but out of love. That fantasy had died, and she let herself grieve its passing fully, without shame. She wrote letters she never sent, sat in the park for hours with no one beside her, walked the neighborhood where she had grown up and let memories rise, some warm, some jagged, and did not turn away from any of them. Forgiveness, in the end, did not come in a single moment. It came in 1,000 small ones, choosing not to return bitterness for silence, letting an old photograph remain on her desk without anger, answering a birthday message from Thomas with a simple, "Thank you, I hope you're well." Not cold, not welcoming, just true. Her relationship with the family settled into something distant, neutral, no longer laced with hope or demand. Margaret sent a card in spring, her handwriting delicate and impersonal. Sophia did not reply, but she did not tear it up either. James and Michael remained silent, and she no longer waited for that to change. Thomas checked in now and then, awkward but consistent, like a man trying to learn a language he had never been taught. She kept the boundaries clear. No visits, no holidays, no slipping back into old patterns. The door was not locked, but it no longer swung open at every knock. What surprised her most was the peace that followed. Not dramatic, not all-consuming, but steady. She had made space in her life for other things now, study, friendship, laughter. Her voice, once tempered by habit and fear, had found steadiness in its quiet. She no longer needed it to be loud to be heard, by herself most of all. And so the forgiveness stayed, not as an act of grace toward those who had wronged her, but as a declaration of sovereignty. This pain would not own her. This story would not end in bitterness, not because she had forgotten, but because she had chosen to remember and move forward, unburdened. The seasons turned again, almost imperceptibly, until spring unfurled across the hills with soft insistence, greening branches, swollen buds, the first bold crocuses pushing through the damp earth. Sophia's new home sat at the edge of a quiet lane, flanked by tall grass and a low wooden fence she had painted herself. There was a vegetable garden now, half planned and half wild, and a circle of smooth stones beneath the oak, where children sometimes sat cross-legged for afternoon stories. She had not planned for this life. Not exactly. It had unfolded gently, like a letter she was finally learning how to read. Twice a week she hosted story time in the back garden when the weather allowed. Fairy tales and folklore, books about strong girls and curious boys, about bravery that did not always roar. The children came from all over the neighborhood, brought by tired mothers or soft-spoken fathers, or sometimes just wandering in with bare feet and wide eyes. Sophia read with the ease of someone who no longer needed to hide inside the words, but who had made a home among them. In the evenings, she welcomed a different kind of gathering. Women sat in a circle on cushions or old chairs, their hands wrapped around chipped mugs of tea, their eyes sometimes wary, sometimes blazing with new understanding. They came with stories held too long inside them, of silence, of survival, of escape. Sophia never positioned herself as leader. She simply listened, held space, shared when it felt right. Healing, she knew, was not something you gave someone else, but you could walk beside them while they found it. She still thought of the past, though not with sharpness. The pain had not vanished. It had softened, like stones made smooth by years in a river. Sometimes when the light caught her mother's handwriting in that single untouched card, or when a stranger's voice resembled James's cadence, she would feel the old ache rise again. But it passed more easily now. There was no hatred, only distance, only truth. And sometimes, on quiet mornings, she would catch her reflection in the mirror and pause, not out of vanity, not out of sorrow, but because she recognized herself now, not the girl who once bent herself to fit into a space that was never meant to hold her, not the woman who mistook obedience for love, but someone else entirely, still growing, still learning, still stitched with scars, but whole. She would lean in, trace the soft curve beneath her eyes, and allow herself the smallest smile. Not triumphant, not loud, but sure. And in that moment, the story did not end. It simply continued, quietly, truthfully hers.